Thanks for staying with To The Point. It is without a doubt the big story that will be discussed threadbare across media today. You're going to see it as the top story in all the newspapers tomorrow. A boat. It's been described as a suspicious boat, a rogue boat by the Ministry of Defence that was engaged off the coast of Gujarat, 365 kilometers off the coast of Porbandar to be precise, on the intervening night of December the 31st and the 1st of January. It was apparently based on an intelligence input, and the input said it was intended for some kind of illicit transaction. Now, what we have in our hands are a set of photographs and one formal official press release from the Indian Ministry of Defence. Virtually nothing else. Everything else is in the realm of speculation. We've got those photographs. We're going to put those on our screens for you. But at the end of the day, what really happened out there on that night, and what is the way forward as far as an investigation is concerned? Was this a terror attack? Was this a smuggling operation? Was it something in between? Will we ever know, since no material evidence apparently has been found so far? Joining me this evening to discuss really and to get more information and to get more insight into what may have happened and what the implications could be about this operation, I have with us Sushant Sareen, well-known strategic affairs analyst, joining us live from Gurgaon this evening. Praveen Swami, national editor, strategic and international affairs with the Indian Express and one of India's best-known security affairs journalists. And in a moment from now, we'll also be joined by Commodore retired Uday Bhaskar, also a well-known security affairs analyst. Praveen, if I could come to you first, you know, we're just hours away from that initial press release that arrived from the Ministry of Defence. A couple of paragraphs, Praveen, which talked about what had happened that night. It was followed by a set of 5 photographs, which appeared to sort of paint a picture of what happened once that ship, that vessel was actually engaged. What are you learning? Can you throw some light, Praveen, that you have learned about this particular incident?
Well, you're going to have to wait for further detail on this till tomorrow morning when the Indian Express comes out. We have investigated this at some length.
Yes.
But I'll flag just some general questions. From the press release that you've seen, a number of questions arising there. It talks, for example, of an hour-long high-speed chase between a Coast Guard interceptor and this boat.
Yes.
A bit unusual there. Coast Guard ships tend to be a lot faster than the kind of 20-25 foot fishing boat these photographs show. It's talked about, the press release very ambiguously worded, as you pointed out, on exactly what this fishing boat was supposed to be doing. And obviously some questions about clarity there. And finally the question of what actually happened when firing broke out, because the Coast Guard talks about engagement. Engagement would suggest at the bare minimum that the people on the boat in some way engaged in some offensive action.
Right.
But this press release not really saying if that what happened. Again, a little bit of evasion there. So lots and lots of questions I think the media will be going over in coming days. There is clearly more to this than meets the eye.
That's the first thing that I can say that personally struck me as well, that there are several questions, a couple of pretty glaring loopholes, including the one that you just mentioned as far as the comparison of speed between the two vessels, but several more that we'll hopefully get into as we discuss this. Sushant Sareen, I want to bring you in on this. How are you reading, this incident that we learn about from, a pretty terse press release from the Ministry of Defence and mostly speculation thereafter? What is your reading of it, Mr. Sareen?
Look, essentially we can only speculate right now. There's not enough information, and I'm very eagerly waiting to read what Praveen has to write tomorrow morning. I think he's dropped a bait on all of us right now. But having said that, since we are speculating, the thing is that if these guys actually burned the boat, they could not have been fishermen or smugglers, because fishermen and smugglers, like to live the good life. They don't want to, meet their maker so soon in life.
Right.
So I don't think they were either fishermen or makers or smugglers.
Right.
but there could have been some kind of a smuggling activity taking place. I don't think it was another 26/11 kind of a thing, if at all this has a terrorism angle to it. It was probably more something akin to what was happening in 2003, that you were going to transport some explosives, and perhaps it was part of a larger plot or some other plot, and this was one of the jigsaw pieces of that larger jigsaw puzzle. That is one set of things. The other could be that perhaps these guys were smugglers, and as Praveen is talking about, that there was an engagement. Perhaps what the Coast Guard did was fire some warning shots, and these guys, if they were terrorists or jihadists with a death wish, they probably decided that they don't want to get caught. The high-speed chase probably is a bit of a James Bond type of stuff, spin which has been put, but it is quite possible that the Coast Guard might have been chasing these guys, trying to apprehend them. These guys were probably running away, and then they decided that they'd rather probably burn the boat and themselves with it rather than get caught. So like I said, the information is very sketchy. There are snippets coming in now. Some there's some talk of some kind of intercepts being taken, caught about some kind of an activity taking place. So I think we need to wait until there is a little more clarity. Hopefully Praveen should provide some tomorrow, but let's wait and see. Well,
while we wait for the Indian Express edition tomorrow morning, Commodore Bhaskar, tantalizingly little provided by the Ministry of Defence. In a pair of statements, one of them talking about the incident itself, the other which has the Defence Minister complimenting the Coast Guard for intercepting, quote unquote, this rogue vessel, and basically avoiding what could have been some dangerous activity. Both Praveen and Mr. Sareen say more questions than answers and clarity at this point of time. Do you agree with that?
Well, I would say that, as an analyst, I would go by the facts that have been now made available. And I think the Coast Guard has acquitted itself in a very commendable and positive manner. That it was able to act on the intelligence that had been provided to it and identify this particular suspicious vessel, pursue it and engage it in such a manner that led to what you might call as the self-explosion. So at this stage, based on what has been put out in the public domain by the Ministry of Defence, my own response is that perhaps, since our point of reference always is Mumbai, November 2008, that the entire ecosystem of surveillance, the ability to generate and track data, convert that into useful information, and finally bring it to the level of actionable intelligence, move the proximate platforms, in this case Coast Guard ships, supported by air assets, and then be able to quarantine this vessel, actually, Shiv, is a fairly positive development. And while, questions can be raised, I think this particular part, as I said, if a vessel decides to self-explode, then clearly it is not one more fishing dhow. So that's where I would leave it at this point and see as to what kind of new evidence is going to be brought when the ships come back, the Coast Guard units, and they share whatever they have, because at the moment we have just seen one video grab of the vessel and the plume, the fire, around it. So I think that needs to be investigated, rather examined by the professionals for its forensics. What kind of HE? Why did it go up in this manner? These are the kind of questions that need to be answered, the more professional technical questions. But at this point, I think India's, I would say, overall surveillance grid is looking healthier than what it was in November 2008.
Okay, that's a strong point. You're saying that the intelligence grid, the response time, the loop, as it were, looking healthier, more robust than it did in November 2008. Praveen, several things have been said. I mean, not that, the things said immediately after an incident, especially in the media, should ever, be taken as, the holy truth or, even anywhere close to what the reality really is. But what really are the other questions we should be asking when we look at this? Because if you track coverage of what's happened on the one hand, you've got it being painted as, Pakistan being caught in the act, a terror attack, a terror attack playing out, which has been intercepted while it was playing out, a logistics operation which, may have led to something much, much bigger, like one of our panelists mentioned, a jigsaw piece of something much more morbid that could have happened sometime in the future. President Obama is coming. There's the vibrant Gujarat, event, and the Pravasi Bharatiya Divas, all of that happening in Gujarat. Is there anything on the table, Praveen, at this time that that would sort of facilitate that kind of thinking at all?
I wish there was, but just judging by that Ministry of Defense press note, which is all we have from the government right now,
yes,
it doesn't actually tell us anything about any kind of terror attack being planned anywhere. It doesn't use that language. It talks about illicit activities, which is not the kind of phrase you would normally use for a terrorist operation.
Yes.
Then it also talks about explosives, on what basis, though it comes to that conclusion, it doesn't say. Like I've said, some questions there to be answered. I'll just, I think the larger question here, though, is about our terror preparedness, and that's obviously what concerns us. And there I'd differ a little bit with Uday Bhaskar. I'm not really that sure we're better off than we were on 26/11. Look, on 26/11, we knew terrorists were coming to Mumbai. That's been established in official inquiries by Maharashtra's own inquiry.
Yes.
The United States had warned us repeatedly that there was this ship, that this terrorist attack was being planned. Our own intelligence services had generated a plethora of warnings. The real reason this horrible catastrophe happened is that once the terrorists landed, we didn't have police forces adequately equipped to deal with the problem.
Right.
And if you look at the reality in most states, the reality is that training and equipment and standards have not risen all that dramatically since. So, if this was a terrorist ship, and I will underline that if, great, it's intercepted in the high seas. The real test, though, will come when one of these ships makes it through.
Right.
And I think as time goes by, there will be an interesting story to be told about how well prepared people were in our various cities.
Yes.
Even as this purported terrorist ship made its way to our coast, towards our coast. I think there will be a fascinating story to be told there, which will unravel in due course.
Absolutely. Sushant Sareen, speaking about the government putting out this statement, and like Praveen said, that's really all we have to work with at this point of time. Everything else is in the realm of speculation. But Sushant Sareen, the government puts out this statement. It doesn't say very much. What was the government's own, intention? It doesn't. Usually, it waits a while. In this particular case, they've put out photographs. They've put out this statement. That sort of makes you read between the lines. It doesn't really say terror, but there is some language in it that may indicate that it was, a boat that was intended to carry out some kind of terror activity or aid some kind of terror activity. How would you read the government's own intention to put this information out?
I think we need to understand, the guy who's the PRO in the government, he's not exactly a trained journalist. Government press releases are the single most boring documents you can ever read. And frankly, very often they're not even well framed. So now this kind of a document has been put out. The thing is that
this one looks like it might have gone right to the top.
No, it might have, but I don't think there are exactly, the best of writers even right at the top.
Sure, yeah.
So the point is that this is, there is a certain kind of professionalism which needs to come in how you issue a certain statement, especially a statement as important as this one. And it needs to convey a lot more than what they have managed to do. I, for one, have no reason to doubt what might have happened. I would probably go along with the story unless somebody comes up with some other facts, to suggest that it was not exactly according to what the press release suggests it was. Now, as far as, something called illicit activity or illicit consignment is concerned, now, it could be that the person who framed this thing out was kind of challenged in terms of his lexicon. But even if it was some kind of an explosive, I think it was, or some kind of guns being transported or some weapons, something like that being transported on this on this vessel, then I think there was a legitimate case for the Coast Guard to take very strong action.
Right.
The Coast Guard, of course, claims that these guys, blew up the boat himself, which also makes sense because, having caught these guys on the high seas, there was nowhere for them to run.
Right.
The Coast Guard would have ideally liked to arrest these guys and then interrogate them and come up with something lot more. So perhaps there was a reason why these guys did what they did. And if they were the jihadist variety of people, then it doesn't come as a surprise at all that they decided to blow themselves up with the boat. So frankly, there are questions which do emanate from the press release and from the entire kind of events which have transpired. But one of the reasons for that is also that having gone through a 26/11 kind of an attack, I think we want to know a lot more than what we know at present, and that is why some of these kind of speculations and some of these questions are being asked.
Commodore Bhaskar, you're looking forward to tomorrow and the rest of the week. Do you see this becoming a diplomatic issue now? Pakistan will get involved. They'll have their say on what happened, depending on what the front pages of the newspapers say tomorrow. How do you see it playing out?
Well, as of now, I do not see this, becoming any kind of a major diplomatic incident because I think, as Praveen had pointed out earlier, this is a factual statement that the government has put out. And frankly, I do not go along, I think, with this kind of formulation that this has led to more questions. Because the reason I'm saying this is that having been a PRO myself 3 or 4 decades ago, the standard operating procedure is to make the facts available as the government is able to access them and make sure that both the principle of transparency and at the same time the reason for a certain amount of, shall we say, confidentiality or ensuring that the information is put out in the appropriate manner is respected. And while I heard the word terse being used earlier in this discussion may be appropriate, I don't think it's unwarranted because this is an incident that took place 2 nights ago. I imagine that it was part of a much larger lattice from what has been put out. Clearly, there were some intelligence inputs that had been made available from a certain agency. Whether it was also given some kind of assistance or sharing by an external intelligence agency is opaque at the moment. But the reason I'm commending this and saying that our system looks healthier now than it did on 26/11 is not so much about what happens in Mumbai. Here is a case where 350 kilometers outside or beyond the Indian coastline, where you have the beginning of the Indian EEZ, you had an ecosystem of intelligence, surveillance and operational response that allowed one in number vessel out in the Arabian Sea to be identified and intercepted.
That's right.
So this, I'm saying, is a positive sign. Let these Coast Guard ships come back. They will have the footage. They will have other information which will be shared with the intelligence and security agencies. We'll have a better picture. So at this point, the reason I'm saying it doesn't have the potential to become a diplomatic incident is the GOI, the government has been careful. No fingers have been pointed. This is factual. A suspicious vessel had been identified. The Coast Guard in good faith engaged it and wanted it to be stopped and examined, as is the normal procedure. Coast Guards do this routinely, that if there is a vessel that is acting in a suspicious manner, you stop it, and if it's a clean ship, it has nothing to sort of hide, the captain or whoever is on board allows the Coast Guard to board, inspect, see the papers, and they move on. That didn't happen. So we do have a suspicious sort of element around this. The ship or the vessel did not stop. The Coast Guard pursues it, and at a certain point, it self-explodes. How will it self-explode? Only if it carries ordnance or something that causes the explosion.
Well, clearly there are...
That is part of the suspicion.
Absolutely. I mean, there are way too many questions. As we've been saying, there are so many questions surrounding, what the press release doesn't really say, what speculation is out there about what this incident was really about. But I'm almost out of time, but I'd like to end with Praveen. Praveen, the last sentence of the Ministry of Defence's press release, it's a fairly mundane kind of line to end a press release with. You see this pretty often. I'd like to just read it out. It says, Coast Guard and other security agencies are maintaining a high vigil in the maritime and coastal areas since the last couple of months due to several inputs on threat from the sea. Last couple of months, they specifically say there have been a lot of inputs of threat from the sea. What is this about?
You don't really need intelligence to figure that out. I mean, Al-Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent has publicly announced its intentions to wage attacks against India. It's demonstrated the capacity to hijack a Pakistani naval ship, at least for some length of time. It announced its intentions to attack an Indian naval ship using those hijacked Pakistani ships. We've seen the Lashkar-e-Taiba resurgent again in Pakistan. And, you know, when you have enough numbers of terrorist groups threatening harm, one of these days, one of them is likely to get through.
Right.
It doesn't really matter if the threat comes through the sea or through one of our other borders. But I think there's been a growing sense of concern over the terror landscape in Pakistan, a growing worry about Pakistan's intention and desire to stop it. So we're heading into troubled times, and I wish I could share the sanguine assessment that our system and our services are up to it. I'm not that convinced.
All right, thanks. Praveen Swami, Sushant Sareen and Commodore Bhaskar. Thank you very much for joining us on this enlightening, well, and as enlightening as it possibly can be in the circumstances when there's so little information about this incident. You can be sure that there will be much more that will be clear once we get into tomorrow and there's more information, hopefully, that will be put out by the government. That's it on